They get to be pretty good on condensing things down, you know. So I decided to pretend like I was being given about 10 or 15 seconds to describe each of these two parts of my presentation, and I concocted these sound bites. So you better listen carefully to this. Part number one. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created because Americans made a wish to the government genie to control the banks on behalf of the people. But what they got was a banking cartel that now controls the government. That's statement number one. Statement number two. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. Now, I just summarized it all, so we can all go home now. That's everything I want to say, and so the rest of the time will be spent primarily just filling in some of the details. So I think a good place to begin is take a look at the book title, The Creature from Jekyll Island. I know this is common ground for many of you, but I hope there are many here that don't know what that's all about. What's The Creature from Jekyll Island all about? And I must admit that I had some fun with that title because it has kind of a mysterious sound to it. It sounds like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or it may sound like the creature from the Black Lagoon. And I thought if anybody saw the book in a window of a bookstore, they might get curious, thinking it was a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that. But all kidding aside, the title really does have a great deal of significance because Jekyll Island is a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia, and it was on that island back in 1910, 3 years before the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, which was 1913. But back in 1910, the Federal Reserve System was created in all of its important features. It was designed and created on Jekyll Island in 1910. And when I began to research this subject, I realized that Jekyll Island in those days was privately owned. It was owned by a small group of billionaires from New York, people like John D. Rockefeller, people like J.P. Morgan, their business associates and their friends. This was a privately owned island. It was a resort island, and it's where their families went to spend the cold winter months. And they had beautiful mansions there. They called them cottages, but you can visit the island today. I hope you will when you're in the area, because those cottages, so-called, are beautiful examples of architecture from that period of history. And they've been most of them anyway, have been restored and maintained by the state of Georgia now. So it's almost like a shrine to these people. But the key structure on the island is the clubhouse, as they called it. In fact, the name of that island and this association which they owned was called the Jekyll Island Club. And they have a beautiful clubhouse, which is now run by the Marriott Hotels. And you can go in there and have a nice lunch. In fact, I was there just a few months ago for a meeting and checked into the hotel and got to stay in one of the rooms. Nice little room. It's quite eloquent for the time. But remember, the really big families had their own mansions on the island. But this is a place where visitors could have come. So you can visit the island today. And if you do that, and you're leaving the clubhouse, and you go out the back door, just before you go out the back door, turn to your left, and you'll see another door goes to a side room. And on the door, there's a plaque. And it says, the Federal Reserve Room. And if you go in that room, you'll see pictures on the wall of the men, the 7 men, who actually created the Federal Reserve System in that room, in that building back in 1910. And I found that very curious to discover that the Federal Reserve System, which I was given the impression when I was in school was a government agency, I thought that should be created in Washington, D.C. I thought it was strange that here it was on a private island created in this room. And then I discovered what was even more amazing is that the conditions of this meeting were secret. A great deal of secrecy prevailed. The men were told to arrive, back up a little bit, the story begins in November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich took his private railroad car, you can imagine, like having your private Boeing jet today, to the New Jersey Railroad station. And there it was in readiness for the arrival of himself and 6 other men who were instructed to come to the station, train station, separately, not to be seen together that night, not to dine together that night, to avoid newspaper reporters at all costs. See, in those days, the reporters used to hang out at the train station because before the era of aircraft, all the dignitaries, all the political figures, all the superstars had to travel by train in and out of New York, and that's where they went. And so they had their version of the paparazzi hanging out in the train station to get a picture and an interview and a statement from all of these dignitaries. And so they were instructed to avoid newspaper reporters at all costs. One of the men carried a shotgun in a big black case, just in case he had been stopped by a reporter and asked where he was going. He was prepared to say that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out from his biographer, later years that wrote about this event, and from his children who also wrote about it, that this man never fired a gun in his life. That was not his shotgun. He had borrowed it from a friend just so he could carry it and use it as a kind of a deception in case he had been asked where he's going. So that was amazing. Once on board the train, the men were told to address each other when talking in the privacy of this railroad car, to address each other with first names only, to avoid using their last names. And in the case of 2 of these men, they dropped their first names completely and adopted code names in the privacy of the car. And I thought that was most strange. And then we find in an article that was published in the Saturday Evening Post, written by one of those participants. He explained why that was. He said they were concerned that the servants on board the train would find out who all of these people were together, and that they were spending some time together and going to Jekyll Island. And although the servants knew the identity of their employer, Senator Aldrich, of course, and might have known the identities of possibly one of the others, they didn't know them all. And it was the leaking of information about all of these people being together that they were concerned about, because they thought that once that information got into the real world out there and possibly be picked up in the press, then the whole purpose of this meeting would be subverted. So that's the kind of secrecy that was brought about this meeting. Even when they got to Jekyll Island, there was 2 nights and a day journey, 1,000 miles to the south. They got off the train, they took a ferry boat across the inland straits to the island and then to this clubhouse. But when they got there, the normal group of employees who worked at the clubhouse had all been dismissed and replaced by temporary employees for exactly the same reason. They didn't want any of the employees leaking information about all of these important people together. So there's more to it than that. But when I discovered the secrecy, I couldn't put it down. I thought, you know, when things are done in secret, there's usually something to hide. And I was curious about what it was, and that's what really got me going on my research. I wanted to find out what it was they were trying to hide. And I did find out. And I wrote about it. And I'll tell you in just a minute what it was. It's not that hard to figure out, mainly because it's right in your face. It's like the purloined letter. It's easy to overlook because it's right there in plain view. All right, first we need to take a look at who these men were. I've already mentioned one of them, and he was Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was the guy with the railroad car, a very wealthy person in his own right. He was probably the most important and powerful political figure of the time, next to the President of the United States. He was the Republican whip in the Senate. But more important for our discussion this evening, he was the chairman of what they called the National Monetary Commission. The National Monetary Commission was a special committee of Congress which was given the task of drafting legislation to be considered by Congress to break the grip of the money trust. Now that's a phrase that's taken right from the newspapers of the period. I remember when doing all of this research back in those days, this was before the internet. Can you imagine a period like that? And to get these news references, it was necessary to go down to some big library. I spent days and days, if not months, and possibly years if I add it all together, at the Los Angeles Library in their microfilm department. You know, those big machines, you sit there all day long, you turn the crank, and the microfilm goes through the machine and is projected onto a big table. And you can just whiz, you see the whizzing before your eyes. All the history of the United States is whizzing by day by day by day. You feel like you're God looking down from heaven, watching history go rushing by. But you get pretty good after a while. You start looking for phrases and topics, and all of a sudden I see something go, whoops, back up, what was that? Oh yeah, break the grip of the money trust is a phrase that came up over and over and over again, especially on the editorial pages of the New York Times. And it turns out that in that period, the American people were very concerned about the concentration of financial power into the hands of a small group of very powerful investment firms and banks in Wall Street. And they called that, in those days, the money trust. And so there was this populist demand to have some legislation that's going to take control of this financial industry and put it in the hands of Congress, so that Congress, which theoretically represented the will of the people, therefore the people indirectly could control the banking system, you see. So the idea was that you couldn't trust those big bad bankers, but you certainly could trust those nice, trustworthy politicians. Kind of the built-in theory behind that. But that was the pressure of the time, and the whole purpose, or I should say the main purpose, of the Federal Reserve Act was to break the grip of the money trust and to prevent all kinds of bad things happening in the economy that had been going on previously, like bank failures. The banks weren't being bailed out in those days. They just failed. And the people did lose their money, the depositors that had money in those fraudulent banks. But the banks went out of business. They weren't propped up and left intact to do the same thing over and over and over and over again. See? And so that was very disconcerting, that banks were going out of business because there were runs on the bank and people were discovering that the promises the banks had made about the deposits they held were lies. And so when depositors find out that their bank doesn't have all the money they deposited in the bank, they get very nervous about that. And so they line up outside and say, I want my money. And when the banks see that lineup, they say, oh, we don't have enough money to pay all these people. We've spent it or loaned it or something. And so they declare a bank holiday and close their doors. Well, that sort of thing was going on, and the American people said, well, we got to have our Congress put a stop to this. And so the purpose of the National Monetary Commission was to explore legislation which was going to put an end to all of that kind of economic catastrophe in the system, and to defend the American consumer and to stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar and all of those things that the Federal Reserve System has never done. But that's what the whole idea was. And so back to Aldrich. He was chairman of that committee, and he was an associate, a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. So it's sort of in the family, as you can see. Being the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., that means he was the grandfather of our former vice president. You may remember Nelson Rockefeller. If you remember his middle name, it was Aldrich, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. And so he was named after his famous grandfather. So with those connections, he was just the kind of a guy to break the grip of the money trust. The next person on board was Abraham Piatt Andrew. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at that time. Doesn't tell you too much about him, because it makes him sound like he's a political appointee, which he was, but it makes him sound like he's a bureaucrat. Actually, he's a banker. He comes from a family of banking, and he had strong banking connections, which is the reason he had been appointed as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. The same thing that's going on today. You notice the Treasury secretaries all come from banking circles, so do the assistant secretaries and so forth. So although you get the feeling that they represent the political side of the picture, they don't. They're all bankers on no matter which side you look.